I'm Jim Haskell, editor of the Bridgewater Daily Observations, and I'm here with my cohort, as always, associate editor Jake Davidson. And Jake, this is a pretty special day. We haven't done a podcast together in a year and a half where we're in the same location.
It's crazy to think. The last one we did together was with Richard Falkenrath and co-CIO Greg Jensen, describing the first early things that we knew about COVID. And here we are a year and a half later.
It's unbelievable. So let's jump into the subject at hand. We've been talking since the quarterly call about how our inflationary pressure is a function of demand outstripping supply. And of course, when that happens, it creates real pressure on supply chains. And so we're going to keep looking at these pressures. We ran a Bridgewater Daily Observations recently on housing, and we're going to continue to take deeper dives into these sectors. But we also wanted to triangulate our top-down macro perspective with others who are looking at this from the bottom up. And so today we share the latest installment of our Inside the Research Engine series, which was a recent research meeting we had with our investors, Greg Jensen, Jason Rotenberg, Karen Carniol-Tambor, and others, and Lior Susan and Aidan Madigan-Curtis of Eclipse Ventures, who have a more granular on-the-ground perspective on the supply chain issues we're seeing.
And I think Eclipse is really well positioned here to share some interesting insight. They're a venture capital firm that's dedicated to bringing what they call full stack solutions to legacy industries. And both Lior and Aidan have a wealth of knowledge about the nitty gritty of global supply chains. Lior, before he founded Eclipse, founded Lab IX, which is a hardware investment platform for the electronics manufacturer Flextronics. And Aidan, who's a partner at Eclipse now, was a Bridgewater alum. And she also worked at Apple, where she helped launch the Apple Watch.
And I think the perspective you'll hear from them is really interesting and aligns with our own view that inflationary supply demand mismatch we're seeing isn't likely to go away anytime soon. We're facing what Lior describes as a once in a century event where multiple huge secular issues have converged. We've talked about the reasons behind the demand shock as it pertains to MP3. But Lior also notes in this discussion, he talks about the growth of e-commerce, the electrification of the world where everything becomes an electronics product, the changing US-China relationship and their strategic competition. He talks about COVID, and of course, something we've also commented on, just the sheer amount or sheer dearth of CapEx investment in most of the world over the last 2 decades.
And what you'll hear is Lior and Aidan talk about what needs to be done to square all of these many circles. And they'll get into the details and you'll hear. But the high-level summary is it's going to take time, years maybe, to change our supply lines and processes to make them more resilient. And therefore, these inflationary pressures that we're seeing are likely to be with us for as long as demand stays as strong as it is. And certainly right now, that doesn't look to be particularly transitory.
So let's get right into the conversation, Jake. And I think our listeners will really enjoy it. It starts with our own Jason Rotenberg.
So why don't we start with the backward-looking supply chains? And so our synthesis, as we look at this from a very top-down level, is that what we're seeing primarily is a massive demand shock. There's a huge demand for goods globally related to both massive fiscal and monetary stimulation, as well as obviously a shift from services to goods related to COVID. It's a combination of both of those things. And then we're seeing, as we look across both the ability to produce in China, but all along the supply chains, whether it's energy or ships or rail or ports, struggling to meet that demand. And as we look ahead, we both see demand staying strong. There will be some shift from goods to services, but incomes are strong, asset levels are high, interest rates are low. There'll still be strong demand. And there'll probably be a big desire from a lot of retailers and producers to restock inventories to levels that are pre-COVID or higher as they adjust to this new world of stronger demand and potentially higher inflation. And we're trying to work through how long will it take for that adaptation process to take place. So I'll pause there, and I think wherever you guys want to take it, I think is fine. Whatever interesting observations or on the backward-looking, less speculative side, we can just start there.
I think we're seeing different parts of the chain choke as time moves on as well. But I was thinking a little bit about kind of all the way down to the bare raw component parts. Do we have the capability in the world to manufacture at the levels of demand that we're seeing? And one thing I think is interesting is that when you look at what's going on all the way down to the semiconductor level, I think certain products are more likely to recover faster than others. Whether they can make it to the shore and into consumer hands is a different question. But what we've seen happening, and Lior, feel free to jump in here with your own perspective on this too, but what I've heard from my friends still in supply chain who are connected down deeply to the semiconductor state is that a lot of the semiconductor manufacturers over the last 5 to 7 years have actually been moving their manufacturing nodes from sort of the larger, older nanometer, like 20 plus nanometer of space, to being able to manufacture smaller and smaller nanometer semiconductors. And that's really where the investment has been. And those investments are, totally new ways of actually doing things like laser lithography. And they're not sort of fast to change. It's a bit more like moving the Titanic. You're buying, equipment that costs billions of dollars and you're kind of retooling your whole line. So the chance to kind of change the semiconductor manufacturing back to having larger, older process nodes is not likely. So where you see older process nodes is in the manufacturing of components like bigger microcontrollers or some of the components used for power circuitry. But a lot of these older, larger components were used in things like automotive, where you see sort of longer development cycles because automotive needs to be sort of validated for decades on a road versus a consumer iPhone that's going to get thrown out every 2 years anyway, and they prefer it that way. So what's really interesting is that I think the supply chain for consumer goods, especially sort of the higher tech ones, is likely to recover faster in terms of manufacturing capacity than stuff like automotive components or anything that goes into equipment that is a little bit older and less cutting edge. And so that's just to speak on the semiconductor side of things. Lior, I'm not sure if there's somewhere else you wanted to take the question in terms of broader dealers.
Yeah. I was actually going to take a one step back. Again, that's purely my 2 cents, might worth nothing, but that's my 2 cents. I think the world in general actually missing a much bigger conversation. This is not a supply chain issue, and this is not a semiconductor issues, and this is not a China-US issue. This is one in a century, I believe. I'm actually thinking, similar like industrial evolution style situation. And you have a multiple stream meteors that just basically collaged together. And e-commerce growth, electrification of the world, basically everything became electronics. Product SKUs, macro situation, call it China, US, COVID, lack of CapEx investment in a significant way in most of the world in the last 2 decades. And when you can deal with one of them, you probably also can deal with 2 of them. What's happening, I think, is we are seeing now this stress on the world that is it's folding in a very different way than what we used to as a modern society. We used to press the button on our Amazon app and expect it will show up in my door next day. And I actually don't think twice, well, how is the last mile and how is the inventory being run and what is the micro-fulfillment automation and where the cardboard is being manufacturing and if this is an autonomous or not autonomous vehicle and which algorithm on what data center and which chip sitting inside the data centers and where he produced and how much minerals you need to pull from earth in order to produce that. We just don't think about it. So I think what we are seeing is consumerization of many, many, many industries that using a totally different volume of what the world needs to consume, that's sitting on a geopolitics shaky ground, and this thing is just being kaboom. And I think clearly there is, I think it's exciting. It sucks for the world, but I actually think it's exciting because I think it's going to reshuffle a lot of the resource and have a lot of really interesting opportunities. And yeah, the infrastructure bill is great. And I love $1 trillion numbers, where we think we are going to see the results of that. Decades from now, 5 years from now, I guarantee this is not software. It's going to take many, many, many years in order to see. So yeah, everyone is now jumping hoops to put more capacities on their manufacturing, trying to figure out their onshore strategy, trying to buy more lines. This is not, you're talking physical economy. Things are going to take time. And I mean, if we just want to focus on the semiconductor for a second, as an example, I do not see any improvement till Q3 next year, for sure, and with not the long tail. And it's not only because of one-to-one capex and materials. I think it's a lot from a geopolitics point of view of some of the way that the approach that China is taking in regards to how they want to maybe show a lesson here before election of, hey, you need us. Anyhow, I went maybe too philosophical, but I think for me it's like, this is not a one slice approach. This is like many, many layers cake that now is coming together, and it's going to be interesting.
So I think that's a good synthesis of all the elements coming together. And so it'd be helpful to hear though, how you think that's going to play out. Where do you think the biggest shortages are going to show up across the supply chain as much as you know it? And what that means in the short term. Is it significantly higher inflation and all of these things, or how does it play out?
Yeah, I do not believe. I think people are coming to this thing with an approach of the Amazon app. Oh, we're just going to put a few more lines. It's going to fix it, right? It's like, hey, we just press the button and show up in the door. It's not. And it's not going to unfold like that. I will tell you where I'm putting my money, and you can take it to think if this is the right strategy or not. I think onshore manufacturing is real. I think we are going to basically see decoupling. Essentially, what happened in the last 3-4 decades, we got obsessive as Western consumers with this notion that we want to pay 20 cents less on this shirt. This is the only thing we care about. Now, what's happening is we don't know how to design the shirts anymore in this country. We actually don't know how to do the material science. We don't know where the supply chain is coming. For sure, we don't know how to knit in this high-speed Lululemon. I don't know. I need to ask my wife. I think it's Lululemon. We don't even have an automation around knitting and to be able to actually produce it. So this notion of like Lululemon now wants to do a domestic manufacturing, you don't talk about just moving the freaking factory. You're talking about cultural change. There is no process engineers that understand they can smell to know that the machine needs to tune a little bit left or right. This all currently is being done in Asia. And the move that will needs to happen, and that was my opinion to Washington around that, is it cannot be we are trying to copy what China is doing in the US because we will fail. We need to think how we are doing that in a very, very different strategy that I believe needs to be a technology first. Naturally, I'm drinking my own Kool-Aid, so bear with me. But I just don't believe we can do it in the way that China is doing that. To go back to your questions, I do think we are going to see we are going to deal with a new type of an inventory management. I think people are going to source in a very different way, including retail and e-commerce. This notion of inventory in hand, cash flow cycles are going to change significantly. That, by the way, will result a higher interest rate because we are going to use much more cash to put inside warehouses because we will not trust the lead time that we were able to trust before. And our consumer will be upset because they will not be able to press that phone I was talking about. I think we will see an onshore manufacturing ramping up in a pretty significant way. And a lot of that cost, by the way, going to fly back to the consumers. So that shirt, you're going to pay more than 30 cents, probably more like $1. But guess what? You'll be able to manufacturing that in Salt Lake or in Guadalajara or Tijuana and be able to bring it with a truck to US rather than put it 3 months on a boat. It's also connect back to what I was talking about is the cycle of design. In some way, there is some good news and everything here because the way the world is going is they have 3 versions of this phone now every year. So anyway, when you need to cut tools on the injection molding, you need that lead time. China need that lead time as well. And we can, I think, use it to our own behalf when we're doing here things locally. But yeah, I hope I answered some of your questions. But I think it's going to be, yeah, go ahead, Aidan.
To answer at a totally different, more like bottoms up level, I think we end up in a pretty inflationary spot for, quarters in that if you think about where the bottlenecks are, For example, even though there's a 24/7 operation happening at ports, they can't get enough trucks out. Why can't they get enough trucks out to actually take the inventory out of the ports? It's because there aren't physically enough trucks and there's definitely not enough drivers. What does it take to get the drivers into seats, to get them both trained and classified sort of into the sort of commercial classifications? It takes both time and also financial incentive, because the people who are doing truck driving could also be doing warehousing, could also be doing food processing. And so it becomes this interesting sort of labor arbitrage game for a lot of those people. And especially for things, certain aspects of the chain, like truck driving, you do need to get licensed, and that's not an overnight thing. So I feel like we're talking on the scale of at least quarters, if not a year or two, before some of the inflationary pressures die down that relate to some of the supply chain bottlenecks and some of the capacity that will get built out, both in terms of labor and in terms of manufacturing capacity and shipping capacity and processing capacity, are built up enough again that we get more into that deflationary cycle from those pressures and how they net out.
Here, I think it would be helpful. So I think that movie, that there's clearly a direction to diversify supply chains and onshore and technology. I think that if you wait, 20 years from now, that's probably the world is going to look a lot more like that than it does now. And so I think one interesting thing from the macro, and it makes sense that if you're doing venture, there might be, like what are the most obvious things that you might transport or change the operating model first. I think it would be helpful to get some sense on how quickly that, and I think you mentioned earlier that it's a year story, but how quickly will that transition happen? Is that something that is going to move the needle in a year at all? Or is that something that it's mostly, it's going to take 5 to 10 years for the world
to... Not a year. It's not a year. I guarantee you it's not a year. And I think actually 5 years will be bullish. I don't think it's 10, but I tell you, this morning we deploy an automation line in a factory in US to build drills close to the demand. And that line, by the way, can build 11 different drills. So 11 different SKUs, you just feed the line with different materials, and the software will know that this is a power tool and this is a shorter power tool, and automatically will build that unit in a cost competitive to what the current manual approach in China. We replace a line of 90 people in China. So yeah, great. We will do less than 0.001% of the volume of that particular companies that we are working with, till we are going to have a critical mass, might call 30-40% of their production. You're talking 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and
by the way, it's not and I was just sorry to interrupt. It's not a technology limitation. Technology is ready. Mm-hmm. It's education, mindset, capex, supply chain. Because now you need to reroute the subparts to US rather than China. By the way, it's not overnight. There is no supplier in this country, and a lot of the subparts, small cables. Nobody's manufacturing cables in this country.
Yeah, and so that it makes sense that it's not going to happen overnight for all of industry. Do you have a sense on how much the economics have shifted? So obviously, the more forward-looking companies and industries might shift first. So if you look at the technology evolution, if you look at the fact that maybe energy prices in the US are now again cheaper than they are in a lot of different places in the world, and obviously the lack of reliability, like how drastic is the shift in the relative economics, because that will certainly be an important factor on how quickly that shift will happen.
We faced in the last 30, 40 years, one thing and one thing only in my mind, and it was labor arbitrage. That was the game. Mm-hmm. You go where there is a low-cost labor. And if I can show you a technology that taking that out of the equation, by the way, now we need to move everything I said before, right? The design knowledge, the process knowledge, the long tail supply chain knowledge and processes that will take time. But in the second you're able to take that out of the equation, China is not better than US, because I actually don't need army of people, because I can have army of robots in that case, or an automation line. And I think a great example, and without getting too cute on investment thesis, I think Tesla show how they actually building a car in a way that people are building computer. So they will change the design on the fly. It's fully automated on the body shop. They're doing reconfig silicon, so they can use much more general purpose. So you can use much more. And the equivalent is Ford of GM that when they commission a line, nobody can touch the line for 5 years. Tesla is changing the line 3 times a year. So you could do it only because there is an economical benefit. You actually can show that the ROI is there. As well, technology got into a mature phase that you actually can use it.
Do you have a couple other examples in terms of industries where you think it might happen sooner?
Yeah, I mean, I think automotive it's an easy one. I think aerospace and defense will push even harder naturally in that end because of the geopolitics issues and a lot of the things that they used to do offshore as a subsystem, they are going to in-source now way faster. ITAR is getting even more dogmatic on the way that, trying to stamp and rubber the long-tail supply chain. I think everything that what I would call it's a high reliability system or HRS. So automotive, medical, aerospace and defense, and industrial will be the first one to shift.
Interesting. And then one of the questions I've asked Aidan, the Mexico versus Brooklyn question, how, as this onshoring happens into the US, how much of it is just going to be purely US? Because it's not a labor question. It's mostly infrastructure, can be domestic production versus shifting some of the productions from China to Mexico or Canada or Latin America.
I think I would align with what Lior is saying. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but in the context of industries where cybersecurity is a major risk or the reliability needs to be high, I think we'd see those move back into the US proper, where maybe subcomponents are sourced from cheaper sources elsewhere. But anything that's kind of lower value without much software technical risk, I think it would make sense for that to be more of a Mexican manufacturing base. Open question about Canada, but I think that the changing landscape from a cyber perspective means that things produced within the country will be at a premium.
Yeah, I don't know about Consumer Manufacturing, but Juarez and Guad, from my mind, by the way, there is no difference. There is, but on basically on wages between Guad and New Jersey, it's actually so meaningless. The thing that Guad do have and New Jersey don't is the infrastructure. And that's why we're seeing this massive growth of Mexico manufacturing basically growing now in a high double digit now for a few years when you're thinking about it, as people are finding comfortness moving their production from China to Mexico and put it on a truck and cross the border to US. The other thing that I think it's now we will get really philosophically, maybe it's not in my lifetime, maybe my kids will be able to enjoy that. The reality of inventory, what is an inventory? Inventory, it's lack of prediction. I do not know how many I'm going to sell, so I'm going to manufacturing 100. It might be 80, it might be 100, 120, but I actually don't know exactly. Now, if I would tell you that I can manufacturing in the second that you buy, I actually don't need inventory because I will manufacturing for a demand rather than manufacturing to put it in a warehouse, get a dust. Is that relevant for all of the industries? No. I believe, though, we are going to see more and more and more vertically integrated companies trying to manufacturing for the demand rather than, for sure, I don't need to put it on a boat for 3 months, so I actually don't need to buy the subparts 12 months, so I actually don't need to cut tools for 15 months. I'm doing that right now, close to my demand proximity and close to my demand from a transaction base, and I'm just going to try to manufacturing for you. For your order. We see it on the logistics, by the way. So it's actually getting really close on the e-commerce. So basically you see now Amazon putting in the micro-fulfillment close to your zip code based on the algorithm that know to predict what people will buy. So I think it's the first version of where I believe manufacturing will go.
Yeah, it's interesting, 2+ years deflationary pressures being high along some of these investment themes that we have as a VC. I don't know if it answers your question for anything near term, in the next 1 to 2 years.
Yeah, do you want to go there a little bit, Aidan? I understand that you're mostly trying to find the opportunities where you can move, bring some of this future closer, and it's not the macro question that we're handling. Any other color that you want to bring in from talking to?
Yeah, on the shorter term or on the longer?
Yeah, let's do the shorter term first.
I think that the themes that we were speaking to earlier about sort of, if you think about what's fixed versus what's flexible in the economy and where you're seeing pressures and bottlenecks along the way, I don't think I see anything in the next like 2 to 3, maybe 4 quarters that's necessarily going to reduce pressure on prices in each major key bottleneck step. And that goes back to labor being fixed and sort of pricing being the key way to move the needle on kind of who's incented to work and in what roles where we currently see shortages. Same thing is true of whether it's manufacturing lines or trucks or other forms of transportation. There's sort of a fixed capacity, if you will, in the world right now that I think companies and governments are figuring out they need to funnel more CapEx investment into, but there's just that lag time in order to catch up, and eventually we'll end up with some form of interesting glut. But I don't see those pressures netting out in anything other than being fairly inflationary along the way, including all the way down to raw components in the next like less than a year. And then beyond that, I think everyone's been focusing on these challenges, and the collective effect will likely be slightly deflationary. And then you add in all the really interesting themes that Lior was talking about that are slightly longer term. What he's talking about e-commerce is very true. Like, we're also seeing some of those longer term bets play out and begin to make more real time how you think about manufacturing and movement, how data comes into play about real time decision making. That is beginning to have a deflationary pricing impact. But I think those themes take longer to play out.
If we have enough time, I'd be going to take 2 minutes and hear from either one of you what you make of any of the Biden policies that are more on the industrial policy side, like trying to support semiconductor manufacturing moving to the US, any of the infrastructure stuff, how you see it, does it matter? Is it kind of doomed to fail by how it's designed?
I think there's a level of insufficiency in that there's a whole ecosystem around semiconductor manufacturing that has to do with the ecological effects, that has to do with testing and packaging, and sort of just like there's more to semiconductor manufacturing than just the manufacturers themselves. So there's only so much that the government can do from a policy perspective. Encouraging the whole chain to co-locate to where the semiconductor fabs are is really important. And that, I think, hasn't necessarily been addressed. There hasn't been capital addressed towards that. And we haven't necessarily seen those conversations happening with the ASCs and the USIs of the world that manage those parts of the chain. So I think there's a bit of a glitz to the semiconductor side that's missing the kind of full ecosystem effect required to successfully reshore that part of the chain.
Yeah, Karen, just to answer your question on that, I'm unfortunately, pretty negative on the infrastructure bill and all of the legislation. I mean, you need a 10, 20 years plan in order to really do it right. And naturally, China have it by design, but the way that they're running the country, here we are going to get into election before we'll be able to build a single bridge out of that $1 trillion investment. So I don't necessarily see how it's going to make a whole different, unfortunately, besides spending tax money.